50 meters below the surface of the Pacific Ocean, something is moving. Not a wave, not a current, something far slower, far larger, and far more consequential than anything you can see from shore. Scientists call it a Kelvin wave, a vast subterranean pulse of heat, hundreds of meters deep and thousands of kilometers wide, rolling eastward like a freight train with no brakes. And right now, in June of 2026, that wave has surfaced. The instruments don't lie. The Niño 3.4 monitoring region, a stretch of the central Pacific straddling the equator, is reading 0.7 degrees Celsius above its historical average. Further east, in the Niño 1+2 region off the coast of Peru, the anomaly is already 2.1 degrees. Every week, it climbs a little more. And the world's most powerful climate models, from the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts to the United States National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, are all pointing in the same direction. They are not predicting a bad weather season. They are not predicting a difficult year. They are telling us what is already here and what it is becoming. On June 11th of 2026, NOAA issued a formal El Niño Advisory. Not a watch, not a forecast. A declaration that El Niño conditions are now present in the tropical Pacific and are expected to intensify through winter. The last time an event of this potential intensity struck, it contributed to a famine that killed an estimated 50 million people. But here is the question nobody is asking loudly enough. What does that actually mean for the 2 billion people who will feel it most? And are we even close to being prepared? I'll come back to that, but first, to understand what is coming, you have to understand what El Niño really is, because most people have no idea. And the gap between what they think it is and what it actually does is the gap between inconvenience and catastrophe. Picture the entire tropical Pacific as a single enormous heat engine. Under normal conditions, powerful easterly trade winds blow steadily from east to west, skimming warm surface water all the way across the ocean and piling it up near Australia and Indonesia. That pooled warm water, sometimes reaching 30 degrees Celsius or more, fuels enormous thunderstorm systems. Those storms pump heat and moisture high into the atmosphere, driving a vast circulation loop that climate scientists call the Walker circulation. It is one of the most powerful atmospheric engines on Earth, and it has been running, roughly continuously, for millions of years. Then El Niño switches it off. When sea surface temperatures in the central Pacific warm by more than half a degree above average and stay there, the temperature gradient that drives the trade winds begins to collapse. The winds slacken. The warm water that was piling up in the west begins to spread back east, and the center of that enormous storm system, that engine, shifts thousands of kilometers across the ocean. What happens next? That is where it gets complicated. Because the atmosphere is connected. What happens over the Pacific does not stay over the Pacific. Through a chain of atmospheric waves, Rossby waves, Kelvin waves, the disruption propagates outward, reaching every corner of the planet. El Niño also intensifies the Hadley circulation, the large-scale cell that moves heat from the tropics toward the poles, creating zones of sinking, drying air over regions that normally receive substantial rainfall. Scientists call the downstream effects teleconnections. The idea that a temperature change in one patch of ocean can reliably alter rainfall patterns in India, heat waves across southern Africa, and storm tracks over California simultaneously. That is not a metaphor, that is physics. And the El Niño developing right now, in the summer of 2026, is not a weak signal. The ECMWF Seasonal Forecast Ensemble has assigned a 100% probability that this event will cross the 2-degree threshold, the level scientists classify as a Super El Niño, a level of model consensus that climate scientists describe as extraordinary, as unprecedented. But here's what nobody is talking about. The intensity scale, weak, moderate, strong, super, that is not a linear ladder. The relationship between El Niño's strength and its real-world consequences is exponential, and that changes everything about what comes next. As recently as March of 2026, forecasters were cautious. They placed a 62% probability on El Niño emerging during the June to August window. That is not a certainty, that is a weather forecast, hedged and uncertain, the way all good science should be. But then May arrived, and the ocean data changed the conversation entirely. By May, the International Research Institute for Climate and Society at Columbia University was assigning a 98% probability to El Niño persisting through the end of 2026. Probabilities in a remarkably high and narrow range that climate scientists described as extraordinary. The World Meteorological Organization, drawing on forecast models from 8 WMO global producing centers, including ECMWF, the UK Met Office, Meteo France, Australia's Bureau of Meteorology, the Japan Meteorological Agency, NOAA, Environment and Climate Change Canada, and China's National Climate Center, placed the probability of development even higher. This is not one model running hot. This is convergence. And then June 11th arrived. NOAA issued a formal El Niño Advisory, the confirmation that El Niño conditions are now present and intensifying in the tropical Pacific. There is a 63% probability that this event reaches what NOAA classifies as very strong intensity by November to January, an event that, if it materializes, would rank among the largest in the historical record going back to 1950. 4 degrees above average. To put that in scientific terms, the threshold that officially classifies an event as a Super El Niño is just 2 degrees. Some ECMWF modeling runs are showing eastern Pacific sea surface temperatures rising by more than 3 to 4 degrees Celsius above average by the peak window of November 2026 through January 2027. The 1997 to 1998 event peaked at 2.3 degrees. It cost the global economy $5.7 trillion in income losses, measured over the 5-year period spanning the event and its aftermath. The models are now projecting nearly double that anomaly, and the relationship between El Niño intensity and its real-world consequences is not linear. It is exponential. That's not the full story. Because there is one critical variable that makes 2026 categorically different from 1997. The planet this El Niño is arriving on is not the same planet. The baseline has shifted, and that changes the mathematics of every impact that follows. Even the most cautious scientists acknowledge that uncertainty remains. A developing El Niño's final intensity depends on ocean-atmosphere coupling through the Northern Hemisphere summer, a process that even the best models do not always capture precisely. What is not in doubt is the direction. Only the magnitude remains open. The answer to what happens next is more alarming than most headlines are telling you. This is not a forecast anymore. It has already started. In the first months of 2026, before the Central Pacific warming has even reached full strength, Peru's coastal regions were already being torn apart by what local meteorologists call El Niño Costero, a precursor event, a trailer before the main feature. 68 people killed, nearly 200,000 people, a city the size of Salt Lake City, displaced or directly affected by floods. And that's the warm-up. When the Super El Niño peaks hard between November and January, the Cascade will not arrive neatly or one at a time. It will arrive simultaneously. Drought in Australia and Indonesia, catastrophic flooding in Western South America, a suppressed monsoon across South Asia. The 2015 to 2016 Super El Niño triggered wildfire seasons in Indonesia that burned millions of hectares of peatland and blanketed 6 countries in toxic haze for months. That was the last one. 2026 is expected to be stronger. There is a paradox buried in all of this that nobody talks about. The same El Niño that floods the coast of Peru is simultaneously melting the Andean glaciers that supply Peru's dry season water. The lowlands drown while the highlands quietly disappear, a flood and a drought in the same country at the same moment. Meanwhile, India, a nation of 1.4 billion people, faces a 2026 monsoon that may be the weakest in 11 years. That is not a rainfall statistic. That is the water supply for hundreds of millions of smallholder farmers, the groundwater recharge for millions of wells, and the rice and pulse harvest that feeds a subcontinent. Columbia University projects global average temperature could reach 1.7 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by 2027. 1.7 degrees. We promised, under the Paris Agreement, to hold warming to 1.5. And here is something that will surprise you. While El Niño is devastating the Atlantic world with drought and flood, it is simultaneously suppressing Atlantic hurricane activity. The same atmospheric shift that starves India of rain dramatically increases vertical wind shear over the tropical Atlantic, disrupting the storm systems that would otherwise become hurricanes. NOAA has placed a 55% probability on a below-average Atlantic season in 2026, and Colorado State University has already cut its named storm forecast to just 11 storms, citing El Niño wind shear that is already suppressing the Atlantic. But here's what nobody is talking about. The extreme weather is not the crisis. The extreme weather triggers the crisis. And the real crisis is what happens to the food. And this is where it gets complicated. 4.3%. That is the average reduction in global yields of maize, rice, and wheat during a strong El Niño event. It is a number that sounds manageable until you understand what it means at scale. Global grain markets operate with thin margins. The world typically consumes nearly everything it produces every year. A 4.3% reduction is not a minor adjustment. It is the difference between stability and price spikes that price the poorest families off the market entirely. The World Bank's Food Security Update, published in June of 2026, projects that rice output in parts of South Asia, Southern Africa, and East Asia could fall by 20 to 50%, not 4%. Due to the combined effects of El Niño and disrupted agricultural input supply chains. 20 to 50%. That is not a bad harvest. That is a failed harvest. And it does not arrive in isolation. Fertilizer prices, already elevated by years of energy market disruption, are projected by the World Bank to rise by 31% in 2026 alone. UBS economists have noted that the bigger agricultural threat in 2026 is El Niño-driven drought and water scarcity, which renders fertilizer applications less effective regardless of how much input farmers can afford. The World Food Program has warned that global food insecurity could reach levels last seen at the peak of the post-pandemic and post-Ukraine war food crises. Those crises, most people remember, came close to breaking the international humanitarian system. That's not the full story. Because when food prices rise, they do not rise equally for everyone. In sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, the regions most exposed to El Niño's strongest teleconnections, food represents 40 to 60% of the average household's total consumption spending. A 30% spike in staple grain prices does not reduce a family's dining options, it eliminates them. The World Bank research is unambiguous. Countries with lower per capita incomes exhibit a greater macroeconomic response to El Niño than high-income countries. More of their GDP is in weather-sensitive agriculture. Their governments have less fiscal capacity to import food or fund relief operations. Their social protection systems were not designed for shocks of this scale. And they are arriving at this crisis already depleted. Resilience buffers eroded by a pandemic, a European war that severed global fertilizer and grain supply chains, and years of compounding climate stress. The World Economic Forum has called what is coming a systemic shock, not a weather event, a systemic shock, one that has the potential to destabilize multiple critical systems simultaneously and reverse years of hard-won development progress across the global south. But the economic impact does not stop with food, because El Niño has a price tag, and the number attached to it will reframe everything you thought you understood about climate risk. $5.7 trillion. That is how much the 1997 to 1998 Super El Niño ultimately cost the global economy, measured in lost income, suppressed growth, and disrupted productivity over the 5-year period spanning the event and its aftermath. $5.7 trillion. That is larger than the combined annual economies of Japan and South Korea, the world's 4th and 12th largest economies. To understand the scale of what is coming, you need to see the full progression. The 1982 to 83 Super El Niño, $4.1 trillion. The 1997 to 98 event, $5.7 trillion. The most recent Super El Niño, 2015 to 2016, $3.9 trillion in unrealized global growth. 3 events, 3 separate civilizational-scale economic shocks, and the 2026 event is forecast to be stronger than all of them. The economic transmission mechanism is elegant in its cruelty. El Niño drives drought in hydropower-dependent nations, Brazil, Colombia, parts of Southeast Asia, several African nations. Drought reduces electricity generation. Reduced electricity generation forces a switch to fossil fuel power. Fossil fuel power raises energy costs. Higher energy costs raise the cost of producing food. Higher food production costs pile on top of the supply shock already created by failed harvests. One mechanism feeds another. Each amplifies the last. And then there is the long tail. A peer-reviewed study published in Nature Communications in 2023, using a nonlinear climate economy model fitted to a century of historical data, found that under a high-emission scenario, the cumulative additional median economic loss to the global economy from amplified El Niño variability under climate change could reach $33 trillion over the remainder of this century. $33 trillion. That is a number so large it resists comprehension. To make it concrete, it is roughly equivalent to 3 consecutive years of output from every economy in the European Union. Simply gone. Not destroyed in a war, not lost to a financial crisis, lost to a warming ocean and the atmospheric chaos it unleashes. The same study confirms something else, something the economics community has been slow to absorb. The economic damage from El Niño events is consistently larger than any offsetting economic gains from La Niña events. There is no balance. There is no symmetry. Increased variability under climate change is a net loss every time. That's not the full story. Because the oceans are not just an economic risk, they are an ecological one. And what El Niño is doing to the world beneath the surface, that is the crisis we are least prepared to talk about. The answer, when you look at what is happening to the world's coral reefs, is more alarming than most headlines are telling you. Coral reefs cover less than 1% of the ocean floor. 1%. And yet, they support approximately 25% of all marine species on Earth, more biodiversity per square meter than any other ecosystem on the planet. They are the rainforests of the sea, and they are dying. The El Niño of 2023 to 2024 triggered the 4th global coral bleaching event in recorded history, and by every measure, the worst. NOAA's Coral Reef Watch determined that more than 80% of the world's coral reefs experienced severe heat stress likely to induce bleaching during that event. 80%. That is not a regional crisis, that is a global one. And many of those reefs, the ones that survived barely. Bleached coral is not dead coral, not immediately. When water temperatures exceed a reef's thermal tolerance, the coral expels the microscopic algae living within its tissues, the algae that give it color and that provide the majority of its nutrition. Without those algae, the coral begins to starve. If temperatures return to normal within a few weeks, the coral can recover. If the heat persists for months, it dies. Recovery, real recovery, requires years of cooler La Niña temperatures, years of rest. Most reef systems have not had that. The transition from the 2023 to 2024 El Niño through a brief La Niña phase and back to El Niño in 2026 has been too rapid for meaningful recovery across most reef systems. A new Super El Niño arriving before damaged reefs have recovered could trigger the kind of widespread, near-simultaneous reef collapse that marine scientists have long feared as a threshold event in ocean ecosystem history. Not a bleaching event, a collapse. And beyond the reefs, the Humboldt current fishery off the coasts of Peru and Ecuador, one of the world's most productive marine ecosystems, collapses during strong El Niño events as warm water suppresses the cold upwelling that brings nutrients to the surface. Anchovy populations, the foundation of the entire food web, disappear. The seabirds starve. The fishing communities that have existed for thousands of years watch the ocean go silent. Marine scientists have begun using a phrase that should stop us cold: ratcheting degradation. Each El Niño leaves the ocean ecosystem more impaired than it found it, less resilient, less able to absorb the next shock. We are now in the latest in a series of back-to-back events, arriving faster than any reef system, any fishery, any coastal ecosystem can recover. But here is the question that sits underneath all of this, underneath the forecasts, the economic projections, the bleaching maps, and the failed harvests. The question that the data forces us to ask. El Niño has always existed. It is a natural feature of the Earth's climate system, documented in coral records and ice cores stretching back millennia. What is not natural is the world it is arriving in. The baseline temperature of the global ocean and atmosphere has risen by approximately 1.2 to 1.4 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average. The oceans have absorbed more than 90% of the excess heat trapped by a century and a half of industrial greenhouse gas emissions. And because warmer air holds more moisture, because warmer ocean surfaces provide more energy to storms, because bleaching thresholds are now exceeded at lower El Niño intensities than they were 30 years ago, the same El Niño forcing generates more extreme outcomes on this planet than it did on the last one. It is not additive, it is multiplicative. Climate models consistently show that extreme Super El Niño events, those crossing the 2-degree anomaly threshold, are likely to become more frequent under continued greenhouse gas emissions. The physical mechanism is straightforward. As the tropical Pacific warms, the threshold for the organized, deep convection that triggers these extreme events is exceeded more and more often. Super El Niños, once genuinely rare, begin to approach regularity. And the burden, the $33 trillion burden, the crop failure burden, the reef collapse burden, falls disproportionately on the countries that have contributed least to the emissions causing it. The nations of the global south, the farmers, the fishing communities, the subsistence economies that did not build the industrial infrastructure that warmed this ocean. They are paying the price for a debt they did not incur. The World Economic Forum has called it clearly. Crises no longer arrive neatly or sequentially. They overlap. They compound. They amplify one another. And the buffers that once existed between successive crises, the food reserves, the fiscal space, the humanitarian response capacity, have been eroded by each previous shock. The World Meteorological Organization has been unambiguous. The time for informed decision-making, planning, and preparedness is now. Governments need to be stress-testing food reserves, water systems, and emergency infrastructure, not after the peak arrives, but before it. The science is clear. The forecast is made. The models, from 8 national agencies across 4 continents, agree. What is coming is not unprecedented in the geological record, but it may well be unprecedented in human memory, and it is arriving on a planet that is measurably less capable of absorbing the shock than the last time this happened. The question is not whether El Niño will come. The question is whether, when it is finally over, when the waters cool and the rains return and the harvest maps turn green again, we will still be capable of being surprised by the next one.